Split Fiction doesn't meander before introducing us to its core premise. Within the first minutes, it establishes that in this co-op adventure, we play as two aspiring writers. Mio, introverted, aggressive, interested in science fiction, and Zoe, extroverted, cheerful, more about fantasy. The characterization is a bit on the nose, but also it's very easy to understand, which is important when starting a game and choosing a character to play as. Mio and Zoe were invited by Raider Publishing to discuss a, publishing deal. Once there, however, it is revealed that they will be put into a machine, creating a simulation of their submitted stories which is going to get recorded and published. Zoe and other nameless writers go with it, but Mio is suspicious of what's happening and wants to back out.
Screw this. I won't do it. I won't do it.
Please return to your platform, ma'am.
I can't do this.
Calm down, return to your platform.
I won't do it, okay?
We cannot shut this down now. Do you understand? You have to proceed.
No. No, I said I'm out.
Ma'am, I told you this is perfectly
Get off
safe.
me.
No, no, no.
No,
You come with
no.
me. Listen, it's
What is
time.
this?
You
What
can't
is
shut. No!
In the ensuing scuffle, she falls into Zoe's machine bubble, creating a glitch that teleports the two from Zoe's fantasy story into Mio's sci-fi one. Thus, in about 5 minutes, the game has successfully established that we're going to jump between stories of different styles. Well, Split Fiction frames it as stories. In reality, it's more like concepts and premises with basic world building. Freedom fighters jump around until they reach a ship and fly into the sandstorm is not much of a story. There is no plots or series of events to speak of in these setups, and only few key characters, usually those directly related to whatever is the main goal or the premise in question. It does get explained a bit later that the machine is going through all ideas of whoever is within the bubble. Now, ideas are vague concepts, which fits the existing level design and structure, but Split Fiction is still hell-bent on calling these stories our characters have written, even if not necessarily finished. I guess for the inciting incident to revolve around a publishing deal, they have to be framed that way, but it is very jarring that Split Fiction efficiently establishes a core premise and then fails to actually follow it through the entire game, really. For what it's worth, in terms of actual gameplay, Mio's first quote-unquote story is an effective introduction to the exceptionally polished core platforming mechanics. Split Fiction is not particularly interested in physics, momentum, depth of movement and its mastery, only in as straightforward as possible, consistent controls. Which makes sense considering that co-op being mandatory, the two players might have different experience with games of this kind. The degree of air control is huge, it's almost as if characters move practically the same way when jumping as they do when walking and running. There is double jump available by default, as well as a dash that can be used in pretty much any state. Ground, air, climbing. And the game is very generous with its helping hand. The radius for successful ledge catching is quite big. We have a rope that can be launched towards special grapple or swing points, and the distance of activation is also pretty large. If there is a solid wall beneath a ledge, then heroes will wall run up for a certain distance to try and reach it. Speaking of, there is also horizontal wall running, and it's enough to touch the wall from pretty much any angle for successful activation on a designated surface. There is very strong magnetism when jumping towards thin ledges or pillar tops, and finally, there is no collision between our characters. Might look weird, but Split Fiction targets maximum gameplay comfort with its core mechanics, and it's quite successful at that. Even swimming, a far more auxiliary action than sprinting, jumping, dashing, climbing, rope swinging and rope grappling, but nonetheless as straightforward to control as possible. The first level is a logically built introduction to all these mechanics. You know, it teaches us jump, then double jump, then tests double jump with timing, then teaches dash, then teaches a combination of double jump with dash, and so on. It does go through all the concepts at a pretty brisk pace, but I guess considering how lenient the respawn system is with your character reappearing pretty much at the last ledge you've jumped from, It's fine, since newbies can still learn at their own pace and experienced players can just blast through the mandatory tutorial. But introduction of concepts and mechanics is something Split Fiction generally struggles with, as it loves to throw in gameplay segments absolutely unrelated to the core platforming and yet doesn't account for players not being accustomed to them. At the end of the sci-fi tutorial level, we commandeer a flying vehicle in the first example of parallel gameplay where each player has their own goals. One has to fly through the debris, another to shoot chasing ships. What if the Zoe player is not experienced at shooters and hasn't learned to properly target enemies? What if it's Mio player's first experience flying a vehicle, the controls of which have up and down inverted by default? Yeah, this segment is pretty friendly to whoever is used to these mechanics, but to whoever isn't, even if it's not their first game ever, they're just thrown into the water in an action sequence that's going to get restarted in case of a mistake. For what it's worth, many other action sequences do have a special respawn timer that can be sped up by mashing a button, and the failure state occurs only when both players are dead. But not this one. And then we get to another question Split Fiction struggles with and can't seem to figure out an answer for itself. What's the point of differentiation between sci-fi and fantasy? On a high level, the genres are used as a representation of Mio's and Zoe's conflicting personalities. Mio already might not necessarily be likable to all due to her initially being closed off, but Zoe also pretty quickly comes off as a hypocrite. Look, I'm going to willfully ignore the game's simplification of sci-fi to something space-related with tons of action and explosions. Obviously, sci-fi as a genre is far wider than that, and also, unless we're talking about space fiction based on actual, deeply researched science, it really has a lot in common with fantasy to the point that blending them together feels quite natural. But okay, suspension of disbelief. Mio is an action-oriented person who needs an outlet for aggressive tendencies, and so her stories are very violent, full of explosions, and Zoe is weirded out by that. Okay, got it, makes sense. My question is, why the hell does Zoe complain about all that when her stories from the mandatory game path are not less violent by any stretch of imagination, to the point that the first introduction to one of her fantasy worlds is escaping an army of trolls destroying everything in their path, and she just brushes it off? Look, even this first tutorial fantasy world we're talking about, yes, it does have some semblance of stealth for the purposes of introducing actual cooperation between players, where they have to coordinate their actions, and that little segment is obviously stylistically different, but conceptually the level is largely about putting to the test everything related to running, jumping, climbing, and it does work great from that perspective. But also it really doesn't feel that much different from the sci-fi mission. Change trolls to robots and drones and it would fit right in the previous segment. From the get-go, Split Fiction is at odds with itself. The abstract mechanical side is fantastic, polished core gameplay with for the most part great level design, but then on the contextual side it sets up a premise it doesn't really know what to do with, struggling to differentiate the genres of sci-fi and fantasy, and thus making the central character conflict that is supposed to propel their arcs feel arbitrary and forced. It doesn't stay that way, but it takes quite a while for Split Fiction to actually find its footing and identity. Mio and Zoe figure out that activating glitches creates a tear in the machine's bubble, through which they can now hear what is going on in the outside world. It is here that they learn the machine is extracting all their ideas, so they decide to escape. And since it's glitches that have created the tear, finding more of them should do the job. And so begins the core bulk of Split Fiction's adventure. Its structure is the following. There are lengthy chapters consisting of multiple levels dedicated to the worlds of our writers. First Mio's, then Zoe's, then Mio's again, and then Zoe's again. In each of these worlds we can find optional portals to what the game calls side stories. Smaller adventures through the mind of whoever's levels are not the main ones now. There's 12 of them in total. So first we have 3 Zoe side stories in Miu's levels, then 3 Miu side stories in Zoe's levels, and then again in a similar format. I actually want to discuss these side stories first, as those questions regarding the point of differentiation between sci-fi and fantasy, side stories have solved them. In one of Zoe's side stories we play as 2 happy pigs on a farm. One of the pigs can stretch, another can fly by rainbow farting. We have to use these abilities to help each other gather apples required to unlock various gates. But beyond the gameplay purpose, it's just fun to explore the locations. We can wallow in mud, there's flying pigs pooping around with signs to be wary of it all over the place. Solarium. Carrot patches with satisfying physics. It's just an innocent, cheerful environment. Until the pigs fall into a meat grinder and become sausages, which you have to control now. Grill ourselves, add some condiments, and in the end, get eaten. This is an absolutely amazing level on many fronts. First, it recontextualizes platforming in an interesting way that's not difficult to learn since the new additions are built on top of the existing core mechanics. Second, it's unexpected and fun to explore, and the twist is shocking but makes sense because third, this level tells us something about Zoe as a character without being in your face about it. This side story was created by Zoe when she was little. Zoe was raised in the country among farm animals. She had to process the fact that these animals she might have had attachment towards become food. Gameplay, level design, premise, and story all work together to add dimensionality and depth. This is amazing. Another one of Zoe's side stories involves saving magical stray kittens in a world with Halloweenish vibes. There is a mini hub area with a magical fair where we can brew potions, shoot fireworks, use wands, ride on slugs, hang around with balloons and whatnot. At one point we have to use special hats to grow flowers on grass to draw certain shapes. And there is a separate location where we can draw whatever we want, not just what's required for progression. And yeah, there's also special mechanics involving lanterns of different colors attached to each player that reveal platforms of their respective color. That's fine and nice, but not as important as the act of climbing a huge house on chicken legs or ending the entire side story inside a pillow fort. I don't really have to explain what this all says about Zoe as a person, because the level does it all itself. Love of nature and animals, sense of wonder, curiosity, desire to explore and experiment, they're all integral parts of Zoe's side stories. Climbing a huge mountain with the help of giants, traversing a majestic desert landscape where we first avoid and then tame sandworm-like creatures, and a level contextualized as a notebook where everything keeps changing, sometimes on its own, sometimes based on our choice, showcasing Zoe's creative process.
But, something has captured the prince. A demon, a crab, or a duck. I see. The big duck appears. Quack, quack, quack.
And look, not all mechanical inclusions are as elegant as Pig super abilities. For example, flying through rings in the air has the same issues related to lack of proper introduction as the spaceship in Miu's tutorial level. And sure, this time the flying mechanics are reused, but the act of hitting a specific spot while flying rather than avoiding big obstacles is still a new concept. But even when encountering issues like that, Zoe's side stories showcase her personality from various sides and let us learn more about her not just through premise and setting, but mechanics and level design as well. A stick in the mud wouldn't have fart powers in one of their worlds, or transform a player into a majestic steed because the story might need one, but then decide that it's not necessary since horses can't climb mountains. Likewise with Miu, her side stories add depth and layers. There is a snowboarding level with scores and multipliers that's actually one of the better ways Split Fiction introduces new minigame mechanics. Because, incidentally enough, sliding down the snow and doing tricks in the air is not something absolutely new players haven't seen in the game before. It's an extension of the jumping mechanics they've been getting used to throughout the entire experience, just with a bit more involved physics added on top and some trick options. This is a different kind of thrill than just your fighting and explosions. Similarly with the game show side story where we have to keep throwing a bomb to one another lest it explodes. This requires a lot of coordination, but it's a very distinct style of action that's nothing like any of Zoe's side stories. A side story that might seem weirdly similar to Zoe's at first is one where we play as Teeth in a whimsical, sugar-coated world full of sweets. Whimsical, that is, until we reach the end with a terrifying boss battle against a creepy robot dentist. Players have to save one another from drill attacks, avoid aggressive toothbrush cleaning, clacking teeth, and end the whole level by drilling the mouth of the dentist, though that doesn't defeat him completely. So yeah, once again, such an amazing way to tell something about Mio as a person and her past, while differentiating her levels from Zoe's. There is a side story that involves a constant fight for survival as we attempt to go through space before oxygen runs out, and one that's about attempting to save a dying sun, regularly sending lethal supernova waves with the only protection being, at first, temporary barriers, and later down the line portable shields, the usage of which we have to time with our co-op partner. Side note, this is a level with some of the best visual and sound design in the entire game. The silence before the death waves is particularly harrowing and effective.
Remember, kids, always use sunscreen!
And at the end of this level, we save the dying sun, we fix it. Or do we? It transforms into a black hole and sucks everyone and everything in. That's depressing, but it is also telling of Mio's concerns and worries without, once again, being in your face about it, unlike, to be honest, the main levels. One of the reasons why side stories are so great at adding different layers to Mio and Zoe is because their core personalities they show to the world are not actually who they are. Those are facades they're using to cope and escape from their personal traumas. Mio's father has cancer and she needs money to be able to pay for his hospital bills in the hopes that he can be saved. She's angry at the world, she's angry at the system, which explains why her writing tends to have violent, aggressive, thrill-seeking or depressing tendencies. Zoe, on the other hand, feels massive guilt for the death of her twin sister when they were children. On the surface, it might look like she has moved on, especially considering how much time has passed, but she really hasn't. All her stories are related to her childhood when her sister was alive, to something they liked doing together. All the magical whimsy is an attempt to bring back the time when her life felt the most fulfilling, free of sorrows. There is a tool in visual storytelling that's called show, don't tell. In short, it's how oftentimes showing something is more effective than saying it out loud. Interactive storytelling has a similar tool that doesn't have a coined name, but I like to call it play, don't show. Since players project themselves onto characters they directly control, using interaction to tell a story oftentimes can be more effective than even showing it in a cutscene, let's say. Side stories, while being absolutely optional content, utilize play don't show in gameplay and show don't tell in environment design exceptionally consistently, which is why they work so well for characterization of our main characters. The mandatory levels, however, often resort to just literally telling. Because in the narrative Mio and Zoe are almost always the only two characters present, because the levels are connected to Mio's and Zoe's personalities only on a surface level, with gameplay not taking specific advantage of neither their differences nor the differences of the writing genres they're using to cope with their traumas, From time to time, Split Fiction interrupts everything just to have them two talk it out.
Hey, Zoe.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about something you said,
Oh, yeah?
that you always put a bit of yourself into what you create. Do you really believe that?
I do. And no matter how hard we try to hide it, something always seeps through. That's the beauty of it. You seem to be going through a rough patch up in the real world, but it's not all bad, you know. Isn't that how you realized something fishy was going on?
What do you mean?
When you second-guessed Raider and stumbled into my simulation.
Let's just say that I've seen enough medical stuff and people being wired into machines for a lifetime.
Well, I'm glad you came into mine and gave us a chance to fight for our ideas. I lost her when we were 12.
What?
There was an accident. We were playing and... one minute she was there and the next she wasn't. After that, everything changed. We became hollow. My family, my childhood, me, just hollow.
But in this story, you made sure you both survived.
A chance to grow up together.
Look, I'm not going to say that quite lengthy conversations between two people in the form of cutscenes have no place in video games. Everything is a tool. It's just Split Fiction doesn't use this particular tool effectively. Let's take Mio's first main chapter for example. We take the role of two cyber ninjas with a vague goal of revenge. For the duration of this chapter, Mio gets a sword with which she can attack enemies, slice pink color-coded objects, and use gravitational pull on special surfaces to change what axis is considered ground for her. Zoe gets a whip with which she can attack enemies and pull, move, and throw various green color-coded objects. Similarly to the tutorial levels, everything starts with introducing how to use these abilities in various configurations, though now with increased importance of cooperation and coordination between one another, like Zoe pulling a cargo container which Mio has to reach through gravitational pull and then avoid laser walls going towards the container. Once we get a hang of it, Split Fiction moves us towards a much more dynamic area where we have to now use these abilities while jumping around various cars and trucks or otherwise moving them and helping each other out. Then there's a segment where we have to fight a bunch of mercenaries and their vehicles that are coming after us. This is followed by a section where Mio has to throw balls towards Zoe, who has to use them to break glass, a subway train avoidance segment, jumping through rooftops, swinging through a nightclub. This is about 40 minutes of engaging, polished gameplay that changes environments very regularly and keeps recontextualizing how we need to use our unique abilities. This is great! You know what's missing though in this entire sequence? A story. In a game where we simulate a writer's story. Yeah, at the end of this part we reach a vague representation of capitalism that Mio has a beef against and fight her goon Mr. Hammer. It's a great boss battle, divided into 5 stages. In the first one, we have to avoid Mr. Hammer's attacks until he throws his weapon onto the ground, which sends a circular electrical wave out. Mio has to disable the hammer's shield with her sword attacks, so Zoe can then whip it at the boss. In the second stage, Mr. Hammer decides to get close and personal before using the hammer to send out several circle waves, and only then the weapon stays on the ground to get used against the boss. The third stage is a breather one where we have to fight against a bunch of mechanical dogs. Then in the fourth stage, the hammer appears on the field with an agency of its own, and now until disabled tries to directly hit us while his owner flies around shooting various projectiles. In the last stage, before the hammer gets on the ground, the boss sends out a bunch of lightning chains moving around the arena, and when the hammer does start acting on its own, it can also dash. But we use the same method to turn it against the owner. This steady progression of specific mechanics pertaining to this particular boss leads to a very fun battle. But what's its narrative purpose or thematic meaning? I mean, you can infer that this is based on loan shark enforcers, but really, who the hell knows or even cares? It's time for explosions, sliding and jumping. Then some creative usage of our abilities like Zoe throwing pillars at walls that Mio then has to jump on. It's cool. Then the camera shifts to a 2D platforming one as we have to escape the wrath of a robotic parking attendant before engaging it once again in a very frantic and fun boss battle that has its own several unique stages and cooperative moments with Zoe fighting outside while Mio infiltrates the innards of the mech. Another segment where one player is in a flying vehicle while another shoots, only the roles have switched this time around, followed by some lighter platforming sections and another 2D one that is also focused on gravitational changes, incorporating them into some really breathtaking views. And then we get into a motorcycle to drive our way towards the final boss battle of the chapter, and like snowboarding I've mentioned before, motorcycles are a more easy to understand advancement of core mechanics, especially with their arcade physics, than flying vehicles, so it's not a whiplash of gameplay styles. The segment also has an absolutely brilliant scene where one player has to drive the motorcycle and avoid goons, pits and explosions, while another has to unlock a phone to disable the self-destruct mechanism in the most ridiculous and yet so realistic prove you're not a robot sequence.
Too love giraffe.
Self-destructed.
Terms and conditions.
Self-destructed. 30 seconds.
Hold on!
It's awesome and hilarious. And then both players get to ride a motorcycle of their own, this time with a weapon system that uses automatic lock-on as long as the target is in front of us, and we finally reach the crime syndicate boss to defeat her on these bikes. Again, this is all fun, cool, awesome, creative, but what does it tell us about Mio? Other than the fact that there's a very big focus on money and debts, which is what Zoe latches onto in one of those dialogues where the protagonists have to openly talk out their issues, because there is nothing in Levels that really explores that. This is why I'm saying that side stories properly handle the central premise of split fiction. They actually use ideas and writing and creative inspiration not just for the purposes of making good, fun, creative levels, but also to tell more about who these people who play as are, their personalities, their hobbies, their processes, their fears, wants and desires. The main chapters don't do any of that really. If we take Zoe's first main chapter, it's not like there aren't moments of absolute brilliance there, like the dance battle against the Monkey King, where you have to jump onto correct platforms in a Simon Says manner, create successful conga lines, and properly repeat his moves. It's groovy, it's creative, it feels distinctly Zoe, and it actually says something about her, but it's just one segment in a series of levels that explore the gameplay mechanics of transformation into a big creature and a small one, which being exactly depends on the character, but they all have different abilities for the purposes of beating levels cooperatively. If we're to judge these levels purely on the merits of creative and varied utilization of the unique abilities the game wants to explore in the next 2 hours, they're fantastic. But as a part of a greater whole, it's like, what are we even doing, you know? Again, the characters just have to talk it out, so these missions wouldn't seem like random inclusions even though they still do. This aspect of thematic meaning is probably at its worst in the next Mio's core chapter, where the premise of the setting is so deeply personal to her, directly inspired by the hardships her father has to go through with his illness, how trapped he feels, how she just wants him to be free, and the levels are mostly about shooting a bunch of random stuff. And look, the levels themselves, when taken on their own, are great. If we ignore the fact that Split Fiction has been a game mostly about jumping and navigation, and now suddenly it's a game mostly about shooting and a bunch of timed challenges related to shooting, which is an absolutely different style of play that the game has barely prepared for even with its vehicle shooting segments. And yes, there are accessibility options for anyone who struggles, and it's great that they're there for those who need them, but this doesn't change how poorly this chapter fits into the whole game progression. progression, especially when after asking players to get used to third-person shooting, it suddenly shifts to platforming twin-stick shooting for a while, which is a whole different style of play once again. Zoe's next quote-unquote story is a little bit better at being more personally related to her, with us having to hatch 2 dragon eggs who then get new and improved abilities as they grow up together and help to defeat the ultimate evil dragon in an absolutely breathtaking, massive, epic set piece. You can see how she wanted to do this with her sister, to grow up together, and how Mio in this case is essentially a proxy for her sister, so it can be pretty touching from that perspective, but again, it's only very vaguely alluded to in the levels themselves. They're still just about exploring various mechanics in a cool way more than anything actually holistic. Though I did say that Split Fiction doesn't stay the whole game that way, things are going to change once we'll move from the premise of exploring Mio's and Zoe's stories to exploring their subconsciousness in the last several chapters. While we hunt for glitches in the main bulk of the campaign, we from time to time get to see what happens in the outside world. Raider, the CEO of the publishing company who has created the machine, in fact is not interested in the ideas themselves because everyone has them. What he wants to extract is the power of creativity that the company can then use for its purposes. I don't want to assume if it's intentional or not, but the generative AI allegory and how many tech leaders want to replace human touch with easily controllable machines that can simulate art at the press of a button is pretty obvious. As Mio and Zoe destabilize the machine more and more, Raider gets so unhinged that he is willing to push the power into overdrive so they'd be sent into their own subconsciousness. There will be no more side stories to experience from this moment on, but I don't mind, because it is here that Split Fiction starts being at its literal best. The dialogue can still be pretty on the nose, but at least now that they're friends, we don't have to go through the conflict between Mio and Zoe that always felt somewhat fabricated and artificial, and actually get to explore who they are. Not just in the narrative, but also through level design and mechanics. Mio is a closed-off person, so we have to infiltrate her mental prison to find her inner self. And for this we have to pretty much literally and figuratively avoid and/or disable her defenses, something that she can't do on her own, only with Zoe's help. And then when we finally reach the depths of her mind, we discover that what the prison hides is actually all her negativity, anger, hate towards fate and the world and everything happening around that keeps gnawing at her from the inside. Naturally, a boss battle ensues. As part of this boss battle, Mio has to hack and take control of her dark self with the ability she has been using in the segments. In the final moments of the fight, Dark Mio and Zoe enter a power struggle, and there's a prompt for both characters to mash a button as fast as possible. Only if they actually do that, nothing good will happen. But it soon enough clicks that in this moment, the player controlling Mio has to stop the struggle and actually not mash the button, letting Zoe help her. Holy shit, this is awesome! This is play don't show at its finest. There's literally an interaction prompt, but the solution is to let the anger go and accept everything. Wow, amazing moment that honestly showcases Mio and Zoe's formed friendship more than any of the game's writing does. And then we enter Zoe's subconsciousness. It's nothing like her cheerful fantasy stories. It's ominous, dark. Zoe's guilt is hidden somewhere extremely deep within her. She can't find it alone. She needs Mio's help, and that of guiding lights, and spirits representing her parents. I'm not sure exactly why they're centipedes, but I don't mind, leads to some very memorable gameplay moments, especially when you have to drink water with one head of the centipede and shoot it out from the head on the other end, obviously controlled by different players. In the core of Zoe's subconsciousness lies a massive hydra representing her guilt. Defeating it in a boss battle is not as straightforward as it seems. At one point, Zoe remains alone, the part of the amulet that was giving her powers for this segment lost. Except, she's not alone. There is Mio, ready to run towards her friend, help, and protect her.
Help! Stay with me! I can't take much more! Hold on, Zoe!
You okay?
Yeah.
Come on, we gotta go!
By Odin's beard, this is so awesome! Look, the evil dragon fight was epic, but this is both epic and exceptionally emotionally resonating. And again, play don't show, everything is enhanced by the power of interaction that keeps players and characters in sync. I don't think it is bad that Split Fiction keeps the strongest moments up its sleeves until the very end. In fact, this is something I admire in the game. Because many players don't finish the games they start even if they like them, there is a tendency in production to focus on the first half the most. This often leads to a situation where the ending is somewhat underwhelming. That is definitely not the case here. At the same time, I can't help but be disappointed that the first 2/3 of the main path are only good in abstraction, rather than as a holistic, emotional, resonating whole, even though of course the highest emotional peak has to be saved for the ending. But even this is not Split Fiction at its absolute best. Oh no, the very absolute best it has saved for the end. If I provide a spoiler warning at the beginning, I usually don't do spoiler warnings in the middle. However, there are gameplay segments that absolutely feel infinitely better when not knowing anything about them beforehand. Split Fiction ending has them. So if you haven't played Split Fiction and are considering trying it out yet still ignored the first spoiler warning, don't ignore this one. Skip to the next segment of the video. Anyway, Mio and Zoe successfully facing the inner demons within their subconscious has destabilized the machine to the max. So Raider decides to go into the bubble himself, as a megalomaniacal god. And so starts the trippiest final segment that can happen and make sense only in a video game. First we have to go through a level that Mio and Zoe actually see differently, based on their preferred genre. So the same elements can have different properties depending on the perspective. An object for Zoe might be just a bouncy mushroom. For Mio, it's a movable crate. What's a bottomless pit for Mio might be water for Zoe. The game does quite a bit of trippy looking challenges in the relatively short time this segment lasts. Then, throughout the adventure, the game would regularly put doors that both players have to open. Whenever this would happen, usually the split screen would combine into a single whole shot when both players are ready, so the door opening animation could happen, and then it would be split screen again. Split Fiction plays with this concept, as when in this segment the screens connect together for the door opening animation to happen, the split screen line is technically removed, Zoe and Mio can move fully throughout the whole screen. But in terms of gameplay elements, it's still two different worlds, they're just stitched together. You can see in the footage how much fun the game can have with this concept. Then we have a battle with Raider in the simulation program. It's fine, definitely not the best boss battle in the game, but it doesn't matter, we get to the next awesome stage of the level. Like in the first part, both Mio and Zoe have their own representation of the same level. Unlike the first part, the split screen line is now not static and depends on their position. In the next segment, it's just split-screen chaos with different levels appearing and disappearing out of various shapes. Then another somewhat boring Raider boss fight stage until the next awesome segment. Mio is stuck in a side-scroller shown on the CRT TV. Zoe is on top of that CRT and can interact with level objects by stomping the screen. Soon enough, Mio will have to guide Zoe, who got stuck in a tablet, and use the device's gyro to change physics within the level. This is followed by another Raider fight and then the finishing blow. Raider attempts to split Mio and Zoe and tear away the split screen that kept them connected. But by the simple act of mashing a button, Mio and Zoe push their split screen lines to connect the screens together and squash Raider. In the simulation, of course. In the real world, he is alive. The real world to which Mio and Zoe finally return. When it comes to this playable segment, Raider fight sequences aside, I feel nothing but awe. The creativity, the technical prowess required to make it all work, it's just astounding. I have no words, but you have seen everything on the screen anyway. The game then ends after a time skip. Mio's father sadly has lost his battle against cancer, but she doesn't have to go through her grieving alone. She and Zoe are now friends, and published writers too. They have released their first book, Split Fiction. I actually like this type of corniness, but given what the events of the majority of the game are like, I do have to wonder what would be the actual, stories written there. At any rate, Split Fiction undeniably ends on an exceptional high note. A high note that's so high that I would assume most players would forget absolutely any issue they had with the game, if they had any. But the feeling of awe is not enough for me to forget. I memorize everything and write everything down, since that's what I need to summarize my analysis with a Stasocritic rating system. Stasocritic is my personal scoring system that I'm using just for fun. It's not meant to be an objective number in any way, just a representation of all my arguments with minimal possible arbitration. There are 5 categories, each with their own weight, and 11 possible scores from 0 to 10 assigned based on specific criteria. The first category is design. It has a weight of 4 as the way a game is played and structured influences the experience the most. This is probably the category where it's most difficult to rate Split Fiction for me, because I have to try and separate my personal bias from argumentative analysis. Because purely from a gameplay perspective, there really hasn't been a single moment of Split Fiction that I haven't enjoyed. Surely this means the score of 10 is appropriate. Well, no. Because I shouldn't forget that I've played video games since I was 6 months old. Obviously I've got no memory of that age, have to trust my parents on that one. But regardless, I have played tons of different kinds of games across various genres literally as far as I remember myself. So going into Split Fiction, I obviously have tons of external context. Context that shouldn't matter when analyzing the game on its own. And the design issues that Split Fiction has can't be called negligible as per the criteria for a 9. Here's the thing. Changing gameplay for the purposes of variety is a dangerous proposition depending on how a game handles it. Introducing something entirely different that doesn't overstay its welcome usually is fine. But Split Fiction likes to go in depth with the mechanics it introduces, until it runs out of everything it can possibly do with them. So when in the middle of a game that's primarily focused on jumping with a lot of forgiving quality of life features, suddenly the core gameplay changes to shooting with basically no preparation and rapidly going into challenges focused on timing and precision that's so different in style from any previously encountered timed obstacle, that's not good. Then suddenly it shifts again and becomes a twin-stick shooter for a prolonged amount of time, with jetpack mechanics that go against how platforming worked previously. This is the biggest, longest, most egregious example, but there are plenty of smaller but still lengthy enough ones to be found in the game, like how after advancing a certain smart and cool style of gameplay, Split Fiction becomes a physics-based pinball out of the blue. At the same time, Split Fiction has amazingly polished gameplay, fantastic level design, and an absolutely insane, bonkers, creative, and amazing ending sequence. And also temporary mechanics that build on top of the core rather than change it, like snowboarding in one level and even the centipede segment. It does too much stuff well for a score of 8 to feel like it fits. I guess this means that the most appropriate number would be 8.5. But honestly, Stasocritic is for fun. I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of worrying about decimals, so in these situations I prefer being kind and round everything up, which in this case would lead to a 9. Plus, depending on your gaming history, what I call issues might be absolutely non-issues for you, as they were non-issues for me in terms of personal experience. and there are accessibility options that can help everyone to go through any problematic segments. But still, for the sake of a full analysis, I do have to call out what I see as big structural problems in mechanics introduction and progression. All that being said, that is the emotions category that has a weight of 3, since personal feelings also matter a lot. And here I'm absolutely free to let my personal bias go wild and assign a 10. I played Split Fiction with my wife, and we had the absolute time of our lives. It has been such a great co-op experience, and honestly, while emotionally the game is somewhat uneven, especially in the first half, it is of great benefit to Split Fiction that it has kept all of its most creative, most insane, most emotionally resonating tricks for the end, since when the credits roll, that leaves one hell of a lasting impression. But the next category is cohesion. It has a weight of 2 and is all about how well a game connects all of its aspects into a singular, holistic experience. Side stories are a fantastic examination of the two main characters, and the last 3 chapters are full of great interplay between mechanics, narrative, and even visuals. But then there's the core 5 big lengthy chapters of the story, where it's not even clear what's the point of the premise beyond having different settings and levels where every gameplay element feels like it's put there just because it will be cool for a game and not because it is actually meaningful for the narrative or the world. So I will assign a 7. Again, it is of great benefit to Split Fiction that its most resonating moments of interaction are all at the end, as that's so important for lasting impressions. But once again, from an analytical perspective, I can't ignore the fact that for the majority of its runtime, it felt like the game didn't know what to do with its premise. Which leads us to context. That's all about characters, arcs, writing, world building, and so on. I will have to assign a 6 here. Split Fiction is a game with a very strong premise, but the game fails to really take advantage of it. While Mio and Zoe can come off as unlikable and hypocritical at the beginning, the personal issues they have to deal with are poignant, and they do become quite relatable over the course of the game. It's just done in a very clunky manner, and with a lot of talking that at times can feel obnoxious. Then there's the fact that technically the levels are supposed to be revolving around stories the duo wrote, but there really are no stories to be found, just concepts, not all of which outside of side stories are compelling, and plenty of the side characters are sort of flat, with a couple standouts in the form of Monkey King and Ice King. I think there are too many issues on the contextual side, but once again, the last third of the game does partially save it, so there's that. But what category Split Fiction will not have any issues with is aesthetics. That's all about visual style, music, sound design, and so on. It's a definite 10. You obviously have seen everything on the footage, but I want to give a special mention to the insane amount of little visual additions, small sound effects, tiny physical interactions that the game has too many to list, and yet it all looks, sounds, and feels extremely polished. Simply amazing. In the end, should we take all the scores and their weights into account, Split Fiction is going to get a final Stasocritic rating of 87. Now, I should note, in the context of the system, it is very difficult to get to a 90 or higher. Most games out there would have a score in the range of 50s and 60s, so a game that's so close to 90 is really great. Split Fiction is not without its problems, some of which may or may not matter to you. But despite any of its issues, the game is a masterfully made co-op adventure that's simply a joy to play. And at the end of the day, that's what's most important for a game like this. Before we end this video, I think we should tackle a topic that's pertinent to Split Fiction, but doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the core analysis, because any game should be able to stand on its own merits. But it is undeniable that Split Fiction has tons of video game references. From some very obvious ones like Assassin's Creed Leap of Faith, the Dark Souls bonfire, and Sonic the Hedgehog Gotta Go Fast moment, to some a bit less on the nose but still with clear inspirations like GLaDOS seems to have been for the game show announcer in one of the side stories. The Easter egg that has struck me the most is actually one that I didn't find in any reference lists or videos that I have seen so far at the moment of writing this, and that's an ode to Entwined in Zoe's subconscious. I believe the resemblance is too uncanny for this to be a coincidence and not a purposeful reference. It made me wonder how many other dedications to lesser-known titles Split Fiction incorporates. Because one thing is clear, for all its flaws, for all its imperfections within the progression structure, Split Fiction loves video games as a medium, and it sends its love to all video games. Mainstream, popular, retro, indie, niche, obscure, probably some even I haven't heard about. Split Fiction celebrates all kinds of games, and it wants us to partake in this celebration together. And as a game designer who has played video games literally as far as I remember, I think that's beautiful. And I think a game that wants to share love, to create unity through cherishing the diverse creativity that brings us all together, is more than worthy of your time.